Sailors of Reddit, what is the weirdest unexplainable object you've seen or detected while in open ocean? I'm a marine biologist. While at uni I went out to the deep ocean on a scientific cruise. We were trawling about 800 m. Pulled up the catch. I found a hermit crab. What was cool about this was it wasn't in a mollusk shell but was in a hard anemone. The anemone had a bottom part that was hard and hollow, perfectly fitted for the crab. On top was 2 clusters of stingers. It was an awesome little symbiotic relationship in which the anemone gave the hermit crab shelter and protection and the crab presumably moved the anemone to food. Anyway, I tagged and bagged it for another scientist to look at. I never followed what happened with it. I tried to search if it had been discovered. I couldn't find anything. It could have been a unique discovery. Thought I saw a capsized yacht but it turned out to be a dead whale. I'm a submariner in an European country navy. This happened a couple of years ago during a transit somewhere in Mediterranean Sea. During a really quiet shift. The sonar operator detected a pretty fast ray. Meaning that something was sailing really fast on or close to the surface. The XO decided to reach periscope depth to check what the hell was that. But once all the masts were risen, nothing was detected. Nor visually or on the radar. Based on the ray, I think this thing was supposed to go over 60 knots. And wouldn't have time to disappear just like that. Usually a heavy and fast rain can trick the sonar like that. But the sky was clear. So it must have been something else. Still no idea of what happened that day. I'm sure there is a reasonable explanation. But this is the most abyss related experience I went through during my service so far. Retired US Navy sunfish. Initially looks like a giant blob of industrial waste and seaweed until its visible eye blinks at you. Green flash. Photoluminescent plankton is pretty cool. Persian Gulf. Sea snakes. Sea snakes everywhere. Persian Gulf a few years after the first Gulf War. Offshore oil rigs still burning and seen through low-light goggles. Trippy. Water spouts are pretty common. Sailing in Lake Ontario and found like 10 sports gonads in the water over the course of an hour. Soccer gonads. Footballs. Tennis gonads and 1 basketball which we scooped out. Named Wilson and it's been residing on the boat ever since. My father worked as a subsea engineer. Much of what he did was concerning pipelines and cables. This meant that he would occasionally be required to ride along in small submarines to perform inspections. He talked about all the weird things he found on the ocean floor, but 2 stories come to mind now. The first was a skeleton wrapped in chains found in the North Atlantic. The submarine pilot shut off the cameras as soon as he realized what it was. When my dad inquired as to why he would do that, his response was, "Trust me. This whole cable project will be on hold for a year while they investigate this." The other one was less creepy, but I liked the outcome. While lurking on the ocean floor they started finding china and silverware. As they went along there were more and more of them. They figured there might be a wreck nearby, but there was no other debris. Just more dishes and utensils. My father's fellow engineer on the ride the next day had strapped a milk crate to the hull of the sub. As they went along he carefully collected a full set as a wedding gift for another engineer on the team. My father's best guess is that some cruise ship dishwasher ran out of ducks at some point in their journey. TLDR, a skeleton wrapped in chains. And loads of fine china and silverware on the ocean floor. We found an empty lifeboat that had someone's supplies still in it floating miles off the coast of Sydney. Either someone was rescued or didn't get rescued. It was kind of creepy. Us said here. While on our way to Sydney, Australia last year, by the way. Sydney is ducking awesome if you get the chance. Beautiful women everywhere. I was on the aft part of the ship making sure nothing snuck up on us. It's a very boring watch, and I get a call through the headset telling me to look to my right. I pull up my binoculars and I see a house. Yes, a ducking house. This was some person's rundown shack floating in the Pacific. No idea if anyone was actually in the little shack. If they were, I'd give them a ducking high five. Definitely one of the weirdest things. I was on a motorboat at the time in a very large lake. Then a hot air balloon was coming down directly above us. They were running out of gas and we had to tow the balloon to the harbor. They were lucky we were there or they would have had a long swim ahead of them. I was training in my laser dinghy at sea when lo and behold an urn containing someone's ashes floated near me. Interesting place to dump your loved one's ashes. Years ago, when I was in the Royal Navy on HMS York, we came across a once-only sea survival suit, typically for use when abandoning ship, floating on its own in the middle of the Bay of Biscay, with one of the feet ripped off. Pretty goddamned creepy. I also found a scruff DVD called Bridget the Midget in the captain's locker or some shit like that. In the locker of a guy in my division during an inspection. That was pretty weird. While underway in Lake Huron at about 0200, our small boat crew decided to go investigate this old offshore gypsum loading dock. It's about 3 stories tall and had been abandoned for many years. Real creepy looking place. Anyway, we are just putzing around this thing when we see what looks like a spotlight shine directly onto the outside wall of the dock. The spotlight was a perfect circle about 5 feet in diameter. Bright white. And only shined for a few seconds. But it was in no time for it to make a large figure 8. Now, this gypsum dock was about a half mile out into the lake, so we are thinking there is no way someone from shore could have done this. We tried everything to recreate this spotlight effect. We drove around who knows how many times to see if it was something reflecting off the boat. We used our flashlights, our signal mirrors, using moonlight, even our own small boat's spotlight. But nothing matched how perfectly round and bright the original light was. We chalked it up as aliens and GTFO. Street. Elmo's fire in a lightning storm that lasted about 8 hours. About 20 nmsE of Malta. The whole watch was like standing around strobe lights until lightning hit the foremast and it lit up. Probably the coolest thing I've seen. Been approached by pirates. Been in 40 feet seas. And been in 2 elisions. Military here. My last unit was along the coast of North Carolina and a large boat running drew gus sank and we ended up finding bales of marijuana and coke along the beach. Us Navy radar operator here. We are called operations specialists. In the 1990s I tracked air contacts over Europe and North Africa moving at speeds greater than 5000 nmh that changed course multiple times on perfect vectors without slowing down. The G-forces of maneuvers like that would kill any pilot instantly. Back then drones were rare. Highly classified and nowhere near that advanced. Can't say what it was because we could never get a visual identification of the object. If we sent an intercept they'd never catch up. They didn't emit any electromagnetic energy that we would normally look for example, RF. So a true UFO. Our systems even back then were highly advanced phased array Aegis radars, Spy 1B at the time. They lock onto targets and never let go as opposed to a rotating radar that only paints the target every 7 seconds. So yeah. I'm sure it was there and not an anomaly. When you sit the scope for years you know what's what pretty quick. Our lives depended on knowing the difference between atmospheric noise and an incoming missile. Our gear was so sensitive you could drop a coke can out of a helo and we'd track it. You could destroy a target with an SM-2 missile and we'd track every piece as it fell to earth. We had to turn off the radar when we got within 20 nm of land or we'd destroy civilian gear. We had to turn down the power so we didn't mess with passing satellites. So yeah. I'm sure it was there. More than once. I've always said that if we ever caught one of those things and dropped it off on the White House lawn people still wouldn't believe it. So I just let it go. TL. Dr. UFOs. Edit. Grammar. I'm an operations specialist in the USN. On one of my first deployments I was the surface search radar operator on the bridge. I was picking up a cloud-like return on my scope. But when I would look out, it was a beautiful clear day. I had no idea what was going on until we got a lot closer. Turns out I was picking up a pod of dolphins that were jumping and eventually following us. I'm not talking about 5 or 6. It had to be more than 20 or so. Just a ridiculous amount of dolphins jumping, and it showed up on my radar 10 miles before we knew what we were looking at. Flying fish actually exist. Kinda like Mario Bros on NES. Thought it was a joke. Turned out it was real. Source: Golden Shellback. USN. The first time I was on a boat and someone pointed out a flying fish, I wasn't impressed, since it just sort of skipped across the water. Then on a later boat trip we saw a lot more flying fish. And they seriously flew. Like banking in midair. Doing tricks and shit. Those things were impressive. I'm in the USN and I typically man our optical sight when out to sea. Think of a giant camera at the top of our ship that can see a 15-foot dal 8 miles away. One day I was getting a really small return on our surface radar that I would turn the camera to try to check it out. It would always seem to elude me and go away while I was looking for it. Finally, after 5 or 6 times of playing peekaboo, this thing shows up in my view. From what I could tell, it was 6 miles away, well within the horizon, and it looked like a black ball the size of a car that rose out of the surface. Hovered about 15 feet over the water. Slowly moved laterally for a couple seconds. Then descended back down under the water. To this day, I have no idea what it could have been. No one else has ever heard of anything like it and I haven't seen it since. On a non-paranormal note, some of the cooler things I've seen through it are the moon magnified to see every little crater, sunspots and green flashes during sunset, the city of Dubai 40 miles away on thermal view, a pod of whales, every sunrise set ever, and lastly my favorite, a group of 5 college guys in Florida driving a little boat 300 yards of our port side with beers in their hands, hooting and hollering, giving us fist pumps and devil horns. I guess it's pretty cool to see a warship pull into a sleepy port. Late 90s in the Navy. About 100 miles off the coast of Mexico. I was on watch on the starboard side. It was a clear night and it was a new moon. Sky full of stars and satellites. We'd seen satellites cruise along and seen their trajectory change in a curve. The one I saw seemed to be moving faster than most. All of a sudden it turns. This was a 90-degree turn. And then it sped away and was unseen shortly after. I called it out to the other guys on watch prior to the turn. The aft watch was following it too and we both flipped out the moment it disappeared. My favorite fish were the flying fish. Watching them wiggle their tails while riding the waves and flapping their little wings until the birds swooped down at them. They would take a dive and reappear when it was clear. Clever little sheets. Long story about being out on a boat at night during a storm when we hear screams from overboard and pull a guy not on our crew out of the water. He's too cold to say anything for a while, but once he does, the first thing he does is turn to me and say, "I need about 350. This is what we were all expecting, right? I'm not a sailor but went deep sea fishing once. Was about a mile or so out and we pulled up to our first spot. Awaiting us were about 5 floating dildos. I was kinda young at the time so I didn't grasp the hilarity of it, but my uncle and dad were laughing for a good 20 minutes. Looking back on it now, the unexplained part is how did they get there and how did they stay floating together? I worked in the weather office and boat the USS Wasp and we were doing pre-cruise workups. It was early January and an Arctic air mass had moved over Receivor and had pushed out over the water, leaving those crystal blue, clear as hell skies, except directly over the warmer Gulf Stream where moderate cumulus had formed due to the cold air modifying and warming, then rising and forming those cumulus clouds. Otherwise, the air was crisp, cold and very clean. In other words, perfect and lovely. I stepped out on the flight deck and was amazed to see that there was also a layer of sea fog which had formed and was about 20 feet thick. What was even more amazing was that the cumulus was large and unstable enough that it created upper vertical motion and caused the sea fog to start raising into the clouds. In other words, it was a fognado. It wasn't a waterspout. It was only the fog twisting up into the cumulus. It was like a Dali painting. I wish I had had a camera with me. Steaming from San Diego to Hawaii for impact. We came across an old oil drum. Rusted to hell and just bobbing along in the Pacific. The captain told us we could use it for target practice. What a day. We lit that goddamn barrel up. Shotgun shells. M14. Pistols. Even 50 caliber rounds all fired off the flight deck. The Methodica would not sink. It's probably out there still. One time I was fishing for fluke and I thought I caught a huge one. Upon what seemed like endless reeling, I pulled out a giant sock. Two things. 15 miles off the coast of a country. Saw a dude in a rowboat rowing out to sea. Just him. In a little boat. Heading out to sea. 15 miles plus. Then. Saw a random dead body floating. Edit. I was in the Navy. On a submarine. We weren't supposed to be where we were. Sorry. Finally I can share this post. When I was at deployment back in 09. One of my friends and I would look out at the ocean from the bay. We would do this daily after eating chow. One day after chow. We were looking out at the endless ocean. I think we were in the Indian Ocean. We saw what looked like a makeshift raft with an orange flag on it. It looked like bamboo poles tied together with rope with a styrofoam cool on top of it. It was big enough to fit one person maybe. But there was no one on it. Me and my friend looked at it for a while wondering if it was a makeshift raft from some castaway on a deserted island. Unfortunately we never told anyone and never heard any reports of someone finding a castaway. Hopefully whoever made the raft is okay. I am a sailboat racer on the Great Lakes. While delivering a J/105 from Harbor Springs to Chicago, my mate and I were just coming out of a storm when he told me I could go down below and sleep. I wake up a couple hours later to find ourselves nearly on the Wisconsin coast and I ask my mate why the hell we went across the lake. He said he didn't know and couldn't remember why. We looked on the horizon and found there were tall piers in the distant haze, and no matter what direction we turned to it felt like we were getting closer and closer. Another storm came through and shrouded them in foul weather, and when it cleared up again we were back on track for Chicago. By and large the weirdest experience in my life. Sailor here, and not the ocean but Lake Michigan. My brother and I were out and just sort of bobbing along eating our lunch. Look over the edge of the boat and there is some gross mass floating there. Turns out it was a ducking rabbit. I figured it was dead. But nope. We grabbed the net and scooped it out, and my brother did his animal love voodoo on it and the rabbit started making terrible noises. Flipped over. And started hopping around. Brother tried to keep him. Mom said no.